Okay, this is, I think, one of four, maybe five programs on the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is the system of things that it's a functional division of things that we can access consciously. So, all conscious sensory perception, motor control, and then the processing between them. And so we're going to start with the senses. And so we're going to focus on, we'll talk about the two different types of senses, the general senses, which have single cell receptor organs, receptor cells, I should say. And these are like the simple receptors in the skin and the muscles and tension and tendons. There are visceral simple receptors, but they're not somatic. Usually these are either free nerve endings or an encapsulated nerve or a modified receptor cell. Okay, in the general senses, these are usually going to go back to the brain by spinal nerves, and it's individual cells that are responding. In the special senses, we have large numbers of receptor cells clustered into an organ, and they're all going to go back to the brain by cranial nerves. So, a general sense would be like somatosensation, your sense of touch. And it's actually several senses. These are different types of receptor cells that are usually in the skin, in the dermis of the skin, sometimes lower down. They might be light touch or deep touch. They can sense vibration. Some of these somatosenses might be thermoreceptors that can detect cold or heat. And then, of course, there are pain receptors. Similar type receptors of mechanoreceptors are in the muscles and tendons, and they're going to be involved in sensing body position and movement. As I said, most of these are going to go back to the brain via the spinal nerves. And so the sensory neuron will go back through the dorsal root of the spinal nerve, and then it'll enter one of these ascending columns, like the spinal thalamic tract, or maybe some others. And it's not so much that I want you to memorize the tracks, but that some of the tracks cross over, um, and others remain kind of intact and go down to the brain. Most of these are going to uh, assemble through uh, the brainstem in the midbrain. Some will cross over in the midbrain, and then they all wind up in the thalamus, where then some may go to the cerebral cortex of the parietal lobe. Part of the parietal lobe is kind of set aside for the sense of touch, and there are areas that are mapped out. There are large areas mapped out to the hand and to the face. This is referred to, these kind of disproportionately large things are kind of mapped out, and the sensory homunculus is just a cartoon representation of the amount of brain space that's devoted to each body region. Okay, then the special senses are senses like taste, smell, vision, hearing. We're just going to start with the two simplest ones, taste and sense of smell. Your taste is located on your tongue and the back of your throat, the pharynx a bit. These little organs are referred to as taste buds, and they're epithelial cells that are clustered around chemoreceptors that are fairly general. They'll react with certain classes of molecules that taste sweet or salty or bitter. And these go by three cranial nerves back to the brain and are going to go to the brainstem regions: the facial nerve, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagus nerve. And they're going to be, again, the part of the parietal nerve will serve as your taste area. Okay, the taste buds, then here you can see their location on the tongue. There are several types, and these types of papillae contain different taste buds, and uh, not all the kind of projections you see on the tongue are associated with taste, but the taste buds contain taste cells, and these taste cells have little pores on them by which molecules can enter. And these molecules, when they react with a molecular receptor on the taste cell, that will stimulate a sensory nerve fiber that is activated by the cell. So it's a really simple kind of certain types of receptor cells located in the taste buds, so little clusters of these cells that are stimulating the brain. Our sense of smell is kind of similar. It's again located in an epithelial area, this time in the nasal cavity. The upper part of the nasal cavity contains the olfactory epithelium. And these are modified neurons that serve as chemoreceptors, and they're all going to go to the brain via the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1, which will go to the frontal lobe, part of the frontal lobe called the olfactory bulb. So here you can see a cross section of the nasal cavity, and at the very top of that cavity is where the olfactory epithelium is, and that sits right below the cribriform plate, and so those neurons are going to pass through there. These olfactory neurons are bipolar, and again, you will have receptor cells that can respond to substances that are dissolved into the mucus layer. And here, it's a much more specific interaction. There are thousands of different types of odorant receptors, and these receptors are activated when molecules bind that have the right shape, and that will activate the G protein, which opens ion channels, and then will activate a nerve impulse going back to this olfactory bulb. And so here you can see the cells linked to the olfactory neurons. Since the receptor cells are modified neurons, they're much more sensitive and likely to die than the taste cells, and so your sense of smell decreases over time. Okay, so this olfactory processing, this is the olfactory nerve is going to the olfactory bulb of the frontal lobe. Then there are taste centers in the temporal lobe and the hypothalamus, where that's integrated. So in summary, general senses are distributed throughout the skin and skeletal muscles. Receptor cells include mechanoreceptors, thermoreceptors, free and encapsulated nerve cells, and nociceptors. Skin sensations are projected to the primary sensory cortex of the parietal lobe. The special senses involve groups of receptor cells and accessory cells that form organs. The olfactory epitheliums contain specific chemoreceptors that send info to the frontal lobe via the first cranial nerve. That info then may go to the temporal lobe. Taste buds contain general chemoreceptors that send info to the brain via 3 cranial nerves: facial, glossopharyngeal, and vagus. And that guy there, that's a sensory homunculus that's actually been made into a model.